Okay. Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Today is Thursday, so it's Jordan Peterson Thursday. We are in the midst of doing a series on personality and its transformations. And this is the penultimate lecture in this series, after which we are going to dive into Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning, his magnum opus, his kind of core work. All right, so today we're going to be talking about existentialism. And as always, Claire is leading. Claire, take it away.
Thank you, Shrikant. Welcome everyone to another JP Thursday. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for giving your time and attention in this platform for me to learn and stumble through this. And thank you, of course, to Shrikant for dedicating basically his life to this group. We are forever indebted. So as Shrikant said, we are sort of starting to wrap up our series on Peterson's personality lectures. Consider this kind of your mini masters in psychology. Next week, we'll be covering the big five personality traits. And then the week after, we are diving into Maps of Meaning, which is going to be a really significant series. Roger will be on board to help really give us the depth there. So tell your friends and certainly help prepare for that. But today we're talking about existentialism. So I want to start with one of just the most classic Peterson quotes, which is, if you are suffering, that's the norm. I think today and this year, we see that more than ever. We are, in a divided country. We are in the throngs of a pandemic. Our environment is rapidly deteriorating, and nihilism really seems to be quite inevitable these days. It's a tough pill to swallow, and it's an especially tough pill to swallow in a country without a larger, really in a society without a larger belief system like religion or traditional hierarchies or gender roles, etc. And so we've had to sort of create our own meaning in that. And for some, that's political movements. For some people, that's yoga. Forever, whatever that is, it's made to kind of create some sort of a meaning. So existentialism really exists to allow us to develop a new relationship with that type of suffering and to rather leverage it as a path toward meaning and really lean into it and feel it heavily. So last week, we talked about phenomenologists. We dove deeply into Rogers, and we said that phenomenology really sets up experience as the ultimate reality in contrast to sort of logic. And the existentialists are going to adopt a similar worldview. They're concerned much more with the reality of subjective experience. They're more concerned by action than actual statement and belief. And this is purely Peterson, that he says, if you're trying to really understand what someone believes, you should pay attention to how they act rather than what they say. And Peterson says that it's because really the memory system and our brain is set up that what we use to represent what we say is really a far different memory system than what we use to embody our knowledge into action. The classic example here is explaining to someone how to ride a bike versus just doing it yourself. Those functions don't even layer on top of each other. They are so really rapidly unique in the kind of part of our brain that we're using to do it. And so the existentialists are going to value actions over words, and they're going to posit that if you're interested in analyzing any sort of beliefs, it's much better to watch how people act rather than what they say. And as Roger said last week, he encouraged his clinical patients to bring how they act into alignment with what they say, that there is meaning to be found in kind of rectifying any contradictions there, and that the fewer paradoxes there are in the way you sort of manifest to your world, the potentially more pleasant your experience as a human will be. So this concentration on action is really a fundamental characteristic of the existentialists. And we're going to go into a few of the gentlemen themselves later on. Another fundamental element here, and then I'll hand it over to David in a minute to kind of verify whether I'm on the right track, is an insistence on trouble and suffering as an intrinsic element of that human experience. And so this goes back to that Peterson quote of if life is suffering, that's the norm. Life is trouble, it is chaos, it is disease, it is pain. Then you watch the people you love die, and then eventually if you get to die, if you're lucky enough to do that peacefully. And so you can fall prey to those things without there even being something wrong with you or your actions. Freud would say that, you know, if you develop through life without any significant childhood trauma, you can be happy, you can be sort of mentally healthy, but the existentialists really fly in the face of that, claiming that life is so full of intrinsic misery that psychopathology is really built into the human experience. There is no reason to avoid it. And even more than that, there's no reason to look for any other cause of it other than just the pure nature of suffering itself. So if you look into the experience of any typical person, they can point to things in their life that are significant enough to explain that negative emotion. And really the role of the therapist is then to educate people to understand that misery, while it certainly might have a cause in their past, is the norm. And it's a common human experience, and there's explanation for it. It's how people experience themselves. And if there's something there that needs to be rectified, that's kind of the work to be done. So existentialists take this suffering as a given. That's kind of your lot. And there's ample reason for misery all over the place. And so the question then becomes, how should we conduct ourselves? Certainly, we could lean into that suffering. We could make it far worse. We could look to end our lives or the lives of others and only increase that. But the existentialists are going to offer another option. Pascal brought up this topic of what he refers to as thrownness. And it's the idea really that, like, it's funny, you're just thrown into life, that there's this immense span of time behind you. In human history, there's an immense span of time before you, and we are just thrown into the throngs of humanity. Whether we are born rich or poor or ugly or to bad parents or good parents has nothing to do with ourselves or our control or our choices, and there's no real answer for it. And that is, what one might refer to as an existential crisis. And therefore, how do we deal with that? So I will take a pause here.
Sure.
David, any? Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. So David, welcome from Australia. And I myself am not that familiar with existentialism. So what is existentialism, and what is where does it fit in terms of Jordan Peterson's thought? I'm very familiar with Jordan Peterson's thought.
Well, personally, I like what Claire had to say. And secondly, I was quite enjoyed the video on by Jordan Peterson that was listed on existentialism, on Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, and Kierkegaard. What I really liked was about 15 minutes into his presentation, he then took us back to our primal origins. And we had the circle of safety, and outside that circle of safety, there were predators. And so it's almost like he's saying that we're hardwired into that fear of the predators, which is perfectly natural. And he equated that with the sphere of safety being the known, and outside of that circle of the known is the unknown. And he's more or less saying that we've transferred those fears of the predators to the unknown. Now, and then he made a few qualifications about that. Now, where this really resonates with the state of existentialism in Australia is that in the society, we tend to be dominated by the atheists. Now, there's a clash between those of us who are agnostic with those of our members who are atheists. And that what Jordan Peterson had to say really portrays that difference. The agnostic, which I classify myself as, and I'm an atheist agnostic or an agnostic atheist, we agnostics can embrace uncertainty. In other words, like Jordan Peterson was pointing out, the unknown is a double-edged sword. There's a fear of it, but at the same time, it's a challenge, which it spurs us on to let's investigate the unknown. Now, where this translates into this clash between the agnostics and the atheists seem to have quite a fear of the unknown. And the way I would put it is that they're using their, let's call it worship of science. They're using their science as their sphere of meaning to give them safety. So they're finding it's like they're certainty seekers. And to them, science is this rock of certainty. And yet, every hypothesis that we have in science is challengeable in the sense that we do not know if tomorrow there'll be a new discovery which will challenge the known, our previous knowledge, our previously accumulated knowledge. We might just be a matter of moderating our hypotheses and theories.
That's interesting, David. So, but this is more of a epistemological issue, right? Of kind of certainty of knowledge and what is it that the existentialists focus on? What kind of issues are dear to their heart? What are the issues that they focus on?
Well, in terms of what I was just saying, that I'm in a way equating the exit. Well, it's hard to generalize, of course. Certain types of existentialism with that agnostic position, which is a welcoming of uncertainty. It's the challenge. It's not trying to run away from the suffering and hurtfulness of life, but to actually embrace it, because that's what challenges you to deal with it, to overcome with it, to accommodate it, to make it a spur for living.
Excellent. So, so in Jordan Peterson's term, what you're saying is that the existentialists are acutely aware of the existence of chaos. And they are kind of open to the subjective experience of the chaos, the suffering it leads to, and they believe that you need to act in the face of it. Clearly, Nietzsche, whom I've looked at somewhat, to some extent, he's definitely a very good example of that, of kind of being aware of all of this, and that the kind of core of what you can do is to act in the face of it, the focus on the will.
Right, okay, yes, great.
Wonderful. Thank you, David, really appreciate that.
Very good.
I think this point is also very well summed up by your first point, David, about kind of existing, our ancestors growing up in trees and sort of existing in a place of safety around the campfire, and that what is outside of that sort of tree or realm of safety is the unknown, it's chaos, it's potential predators, whatever shape they are in. But we're also humans are also predators. And so there's this sort of paradoxical wiring about the unknown in which we see it as the potential for chaos, for destruction, but it's also, herein lies the meaning, right? And we as humans are wired to follow that and to want to really understand what that is. And so while negative emotion is a very powerful motivator, and Peterson says because you can be completely dead, like that's it. So of course, negative emotion toward that chaos is a negative motivator, but second to that is the positive emotion that comes from following some sort of meaning or creating, order from the chaos and creating light in the dark. And so this paradox is really core to the existentials, that yes, it's as bad as it can be, but therein lies kind of the power and the potential for meaning. So this scientific method is what gave us that power, right? Historically, with that worldview became kind of the ability to blow holes in our value systems and create this kind of either nihilism or some sort of proclivity toward fascism. What we know is that nihilism really leaves us with nothing. So as we say, existentialism here is facing what you're afraid of, right? It's exposure to the things that we don't want to be exposed to. And Peterson says that exposure is curative if we expose ourselves to it voluntarily. So certainly it's one thing that if bad things pop up when you're not expecting it, that's a stressor that will cause your body to produce a lot of cortisol and you're not gonna like it. However, voluntary exposure is really one of the prime things that can cure people. And that Peterson is speaking really from his clinical experience here. That's how people learn. He uses the example of if you're a child, you really exist in a place of happiness and everything is all fine until your parent leaves you at the mall and you lose that place of order or that safety net, and suddenly, boom, you're in a place of chaos and you are having a tantrum. And human beings, similarly, we exist in a place of calm when we feel like we're in a place of safety, a place that we've totally understood. But often, that's not the case. We cannot always, inhabit a walled city. He uses some Skinner experiments on rats to educate or to show this point. So basically, Skinner was really good at animal behavior and training animals to do all sorts of things. He did these experiments on rats where he really made them solitary. They're not solitary creatures. He starved them, so they were very hungry and very food conscious. And then he would take the rats out and put them in testing chambers, expose them to kind of a shock, and pair the light with the shock, so they really became to understand that kind of cause and effect. And what he found is when you put that rat in a new place, it's immediately going to freeze up. That's an instinctual response. And then it will start to use its nose to really explore every element of that territory to make sure that there aren't other predators there, to make sure that it is somewhat sound. And then finally, if it has explored kind of every inch and cranny of that territory, it will start to relax, is what he noticed. And then suddenly you shock it and boom, its whole system chokes up again, because what it came to understand about its environment wasn't order, it was chaos, right? And it realizes then that it didn't know that at the time. And this is, a similar, the classic Peterson example here is the cheating husband, right? That boom, you thought you were in order, and all of a sudden you realize that your whole worldview is potentially at stake. So how do you make human life more livable? Live in that explored territory, right? That's where you can maintain some sort of emotional stability, it's in the depths of our own sort of existential terror that the wisdom to cope with any behaviors will be found. So it is in that darkness that the potential to understand the darkness can be found. It won't protect you from that darkness. It won't protect you from the anxiety, but it will give you the tools to learn how to deal with it. So classic example here is fire. So fire is a really archetypical symbol for humans. We mastered fire about 2 million years ago. And fire is the perfect example of this paradox because it's dangerous. But it also has all sorts of possibility and opportunity, and it really allowed us to develop our brains because we didn't have to spend all day chewing leaves like monkeys do, and have really long intestinal tracts to process that. So it allowed us to cook, it allowed us to really develop our brains. So in this way, Peterson says that if you match your behavior to the phenomena, that's where the magic happens, right? So if you're stressing yourself optimally in a way that incorporates the information, the fire, the potential for power, herein sort of lies the magic. And there's more to it than you know, and you won't know it until you dive in. So in this way, I think it's sort of romantic in that these existentialists are inherently pessimistic, right? Life is suffering. It is only going to get worse. This is awful, but also romantically optimistic, that humans are very weak, but they're also very strong, and they have an ability to fake that. The ability to face that weakness is limitless. And so in this way, it makes sort of the strongest case possible for the weakness of human beings, and out of that also the strongest case possible for their strength. And so to be weak and useless is obviously a very strong weapon. People like to play into that martyrdom, and that is powerful, but it's not as powerful as facing the chaos and harnessing it yourself. And because modern people have really been stripped, Peterson says, of their more archaic belief systems, they're exposed to much more possibility of a meaningless and a painful experience with no superordinate meaning. And this is purely kind of Nietzschean idea that because we're stripped of that archaic, mythological, more religion-based belief system, it's really tough for us to kind of process this pain and suffering. Another really important idea of existentialism is that the locale of that action-oriented, is in the individual. And so, you as a sufferer are going through a very individual experience, which is true to you just as much as it's true to the next person. And so he really, this thought process encourages us to see the individual as the correct level of psychoanalysis. And really, this is an individual-based process. So when you're trying to improve human adaptation or human evolution or human experience, I'm really encouraging us to do that at the individual level. So as I said, Peterson says the existentialists are sort of romantics in that they are thinkers that deny the overarching supremacy of rationality and intellect. And that's important historically in the place that it came up as well. Human beings are emotional, they're not rational. Rationality really cannot operate, truth cannot operate unless it's embodied and motivated and emotionally minded. We need those emotions to really act as guides. And in that way, rationality has to be augmented by other ways of being. So I'm going to dive now into the three thinkers that and existentialists that Peterson talks about. We'll do some quotes and stuff, but of course we have to start with Nietzsche. So Nietzsche was truly a genius. He was a full professor by the age of 24, but he also lived a life of deep suffering. He was extremely sick. His father died young. He died young as well, potentially syphilis, but TBD, we're not exactly sure about that. Nietzsche really sort of elevated truth to the highest virtue, or I'm sorry, he identified that Christianity elevated truth to the highest virtue, and was really fascinated by the way that truth sort of ate its own tail and became its own destruction in the end. And I think because because of this sickness, and he was really ill as a young kid, he really wrote a lot. It allowed him to just kind of siphon off and write a lot, do it in really brief spurts because of his physical ailments. And because of this, you get this really dense, rich, although short writing. He wasn't famous in his time. He only sold about 500 copies of Beyond Good and Evil in his lifetime, but of course is now one of the top 10 most influential thinkers of the 20th century. So to start with a Nietzsche quote, for some time now, our whole European culture has been moving with a tortured tension that is growing from decade to decade, as toward a catastrophe, relentlessly, violently, headlong, like a river that wants to reach the end and no longer reflects, that it is afraid to reflect. So Nietzsche identified long before its time, the advent of nihilism and why that had become necessary. That the values that humans had really hitherto drawn had kind of had their final consequence and were no longer relevant. And therefore, he said that we must develop new values and new systems on top of that. So, as we said, Nietzsche believed that, if things are going bad for you, it's quite easy to blame society, to blame corruption, to blame our bodies. And really, he offers in the face of that a flat out no, that distress in any right need not produce nihilism. That does not have to be the outcome. There's multiple outcomes to any situation or any experience that we have. Peterson uses the example of child abuse. So most people that abuse children were abused as a child, but it is absolutely not the case that most people who are abused go on to abuse other children. There are always two options to everything. Some people who are bullied become bullies themselves, and some learn absolutely what not to do and become, really fly in the face of that and really try to resist it. And in this way, two opposite conclusions can be pulled from the same experience, and such distress and human distress really can always permit a variety of interpretations and experiences. So when you lose faith in something because you're human, the fact that you lost faith in it, is very easy to lose faith in everything. And that's kind of a natural conclusion that we jump to, that when one thing collapses, why can't the whole structure that is built on collapse also? And of course, that's a nihilistic structure. And so when your value system collapses, when you lose the ability to have that positive emotion because you're creating order out of chaos, all you're left with is the negative emotion. And what a tough place to kind of live in. And so, historically, this kind of gave us two options, totalitarianism, which might be slightly better than nihilism. But I think what we see in today's age is a pretty solid bounce between the two toward really radical ideologies, in contrast to kind of the nihilism that is having no ideology at all or no kind of thought of meaning. So veering over into Dostoevsky, who Peterson kind of bounces up as sort of the fictional counter to Nietzsche, and Peterson is just a big fan of all these writings. Crime and Punishment, Notes from the Underground, absolutely recommends that this is on everyone's reading list. So a quote from Notes from the Underground. In short, one may say anything about the history of the world, anything that might enter the most disordered imagination. The one thing one can't say is that it's rational. The word sticks in one's throat. And so in this way, a lot of things operate through rational principles and truth and science, but history does not. History is a slaughterhouse. It is a catastrophe, and rationality really fails to explain that in every way possible. To quote him again, nevertheless, one may say something about the history of the world, Oh, I already said this. However, certainly this is the odd thing that is constantly happening. There are frequently turning up in life, sodding a wise persons, sages, and lovers of human culture who make their matter to bear all their lives as ethically and realistically as possible. Also to be, so to speak, a light to the neighbors directly in order to show them that it is executable to live morally and rationally in this planet. And what he's doing here is he's playing up in contrast to the kind of potential for naivety, this criticism of almost a utopian outlook, that everything is going to be fine. And this is an outlook that emerged in Russia in the 1880s. And Dostoevsky kind of knew that was not effective and that would never happen. Because if you give people exactly what they need and exactly what they want, it's not a logical conclusion to presume that will make them happy. You can make people satiated, but what makes you think that it's a good thing to take away people's pain? What makes you think that if you had everything you asked for, you would be satiated? What if, in contrast, the pain is what you need, it's what you want? Maybe that is what gives life meaning. And this is really core to Peterson's pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. So our third thinker here, Kierkegaard, was a Danish philosopher, theologian, poet. He really did it all. And he's really considered to be one of the first existentialist philosophers. He was also a critic of Christianity. And I will quote him here: "For when all combine in every way to make everything easier, there remains only one possible danger. Namely, that the ease becomes so great that it becomes altogether too great, and then there is only one want left, though it is not yet a felt want, when people will want difficulty." And that one kind of gives me goosebumps because, gosh, it sounds like that's something that we want today. So in conclusion, I'm going to read two more lines, one from Dostoevsky, one from May, and then we will break out for some questions here. But I encourage you to just let your mind be blank and listen to some of the greatest writers of our time. So to quote Dostoevsky, "Does not man, perhaps, love something besides well-being? Perhaps he is just as fond of suffering. Perhaps suffering is just as great a benefit to him as well-being. Man, if sometimes extraordinarily, passionately in love with suffering, and that is a fact. There is no need to appeal to universal history to prove that. Only ask yourself if you are a man and you have lived at all. As far as my personal opinion is concerned, to care only for well-being seems to be positively ill-bred. Whether it's good or bad, it is sometimes very pleasant to smash things. I hold no brief for suffering, nor for well-being either. I am standing for my caprice, and for its being guaranteed to me when suffering. Suffering would be out of place in amusement parks, for instance. I know that. In the Palace of Crystal, it is unthinkable. Suffering means doubt, negation, and what would the good of a Palace of Crystal be if there could be any doubt about it? And yet, I think man will never renounce real suffering. That is destruction and chaos. Why? Suffering is the whole origin of consciousness. Although I did lay it down at the beginning, and consciousness is the greatest misfortune for man, yet I know man prizes it and would not give it up for any satisfaction. We are now in a position to see the circular significance of the existential psychotherapy movements. It is precisely the movement that protests against the tendency to identify psychotherapy with technical reason. And finally, to talk about existentialists really in all, May writes in his book Origins, "We have seen that Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, as well as the representatives of existential cultural movement following them, not only contributed far-reaching and penetrating psychological insights, which in themselves form a significant contribution to anyone seeking scientifically to understand modern psychological problems, but also it did something else. They placed these insights on an ontological basis, namely the study of man as the being who has these particular problems. They believed that this was absolutely necessary to be done, and they feared that the subordination of reason to technical problems would ultimately mean the making of man over in the image of the machine. And with that, I will hand it back to you, Shrikant.
Thanks, Claire. So what I want to do now is to invite people who have watched this video to offer their thoughts on the video. You can take up to 3 to 4 minutes to talk about whatever you found interesting about it. So it's going to be Pegor, Stefan, Dave, and Paul next. If anybody else wants to talk, you can just go ahead and type exclamation mark in chat. Pegor, go ahead.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so what I found interesting was sort of an analysis of the video and like how obvious it seems or how brutally clear it seems that we will never reach utopia, that it is built in our nature to never be satisfied. And it's sort of, it's either in this video or in another video, Peterson talks about like when you have a goal and you're moving towards the goal, you get dopamine hits. But as soon as you hit the goal, the dopamine stops and your positive emotions sort of shut down a bit, maybe for like a while, but then you lose your positive emotions associated with that. And so that's like a mini metaphor of achieving utopia. Like, you know, your utopia is to graduate from graduate school, you get your master's degree, and then like a week later, you're depressed and there's all these negative emotions, you don't know what to do. And so I can't help but sort of compare this or resort to religion, where like the utopia is post-death, where we are no longer human, which is I think a very interesting idea, that in order to sort of achieve utopia or live in utopia, we need to stop being human, so to speak. And so it's something very interesting to sort of keep in mind, especially in these like political times where people keep offering utopias, so to speak.
Excellent. I think, Pegor, that was a brilliant observation. I think this is a distinction between a projected kind of goal where you almost reach, it's a static ideal. It's like you go there and there is really nothing to do there. You just go there, and that is considered to be good. Whereas what this is focusing on, or what Jordan Peterson focuses on again and again, is the struggle, is the process of encountering challenges, suffering through them, and going, going past them. So excellent point. Next up is Stefan. Stefan, go ahead. You need to unmute yourself. Okay, I don't know what's going on with Stefan.
Do you mean me?
No, Stefan.
Okay, yes.
Let me see. I don't know whether he is here. Let me start with Dave. Dave, go ahead.
Thank you, Shrikant, and a good presentation, Claire. Boy, this was a real downer. As we would say back home, this guy wouldn't make a living working for Hallmark cards. But I had 3 big points I picked up. One is I'd always heard before this God is dead thing, but the point that Christianity killed itself was the amazing point, that Christianity emphasized truth. But then when you go back and analyze Christianity, you start seeing the contradictions, and ergo, then you fall away from the faith. So I thought that was a very good point. And then about, I think it was Kierkegaard talking about, people want difficulty, and because everybody thinks you want easiness. But I was just thinking, here we have just gone through Halloween and all the horror movies. And I think about, well, you go to the amusement park, well, you get on this ride that's going to scare the hell out of you. And it's just so counterintuitive that we don't want happiness. We want to be terrorized. And the last about the utopia, I would state a little bit differently, Claire, and he talked about piano keys, but I think it's the expression I remember as being pigeonholed. People don't want to be told what to do, even if it's for their benefit, where it's healthcare or something like that. And the big phrase I emphasize or I hear is politically correct. Oh, he's a rotten person, but he's not politically correct. So, yay, he's not politically correct. I'm with him. So strong things. It was a very insightful lecture. And like I said, a real downer, but I really enjoyed it. Got a lot out of it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave. Okay, Stephen, it was you. Sorry, I mistook two names. Go ahead, Stephen. What are your thoughts about the video?
Okay, I wasn't exactly ready to share them.
That's fine. Then you don't need to do that. You can do it later on.
Okay,
Paul,
sure.
go ahead. Paul S.
You're muted.
Some people would like for me to be muted all the time, but anyway. When I was 18 or 19, when I heard people that when I knew people and heard people who didn't know who Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, or Nietzsche is, the people which I call normal, I really didn't thought too much about them, and I still don't. That's why I really started loving Jordan Peterson when I came here to Canada, and I realized that somebody who has Canadian education and he knows so much about half of my youth years. I was able to escape and graduate because I had knowledge and I had access to those books. Because people were over back in socialist Czechoslovakia, people needed those books. We all were going after them, after those books. So those books, because I had enough of them, I was able to give that to my professors, and they helped me to graduate. Because otherwise, I wouldn't be able to graduate because my political studies were not too much towards socialism. Anyway, but back to the Jordan Peterson video. Certainly that it's the best of all those videos, because he is explaining what with existentialism, what it is. Yes, Pascal started with the Thrones, but we all know that Heidegger, in his Being and Time, completely, who read Being and Time, since then we understand existentialism, and we understand what being thrown in the world is. Mainly, when you think about that, it's Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky. With their book, with their writing, that's the typical example of throwness be in the world. Nietzsche was actually going farther than that. He started on Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, and Schopenhauer, and he went farther. He knew how to explain and how to predict the world which happened, everything what he predicted, the collapse of Christianity, collapse of moralism in 19th century, and he predicted what will happen in 20th century. When you go to almost any of your books, you will see it. You will know that the horrible things which happened with fascism and communism, Nietzsche already predicted, because that collapse of Christianity, when he said God is dead, he wasn't against the God, he wasn't against Christianity. He was just explaining that our moral laws, which we had within Christianity until then, basically didn't stop exist. And what we were thinking to replace it with was horrible. And we all know not what happened in 20th century. That was horrible. And because Jordan Peterson understands that, that's why I think that he is one of the best psychologists which is alive. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. I think what happens is that the darkness, dark side of life, of what is possible, how bad things can be, many people don't get that, in the sense that they actually ignore it whenever it's there in their lives to some extent, but they ignore it. And they kind of replace it with these kind of sugary visions.
Can I add something?
Please.
Okay. Again, a little bit different is for me, because I came from Central Europe, where everything was around that, and we lived in a lie, because nobody over there in East Germany or Czechoslovakia, nobody believed in the system. So we live double lives. We live life at work and we live life in our heads. And the saying is, when I come here to English speaking world, you automatically say, how are you? How you doing in that? And the answer is good. When you said, how are you in Czech or in East Germany, you always say, sorry for my language, worth of shit. That was the automatic answer. Nobody would answer good, because we were all living in darkness over there. It was automatic. We lived all in our head. We were living two lives. So that existentialism was much closer to us. That's why we all read Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and mainly Dostoevsky, because Dostoevsky being Russian, so he was allowed. And unfortunately, the communists didn't understand Dostoevsky, so that's why they allow us to read it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, let's see. Diana had a question in the chat. Let me see. So I'm going to ask this to Claire. Claire, what if there is suffering after suffering? It's not meaningful in that state, is it?
So one thing is, it is guaranteed that there will be suffering after suffering. The first suffering is only the first step. And I think Maritza hit it on the nail here when she responded and said, maybe consider that the suffering is the meaning. And absolutely herein lies the answer. And so to greet that suffering as the opportunity for growth is really formative. And I think Alex asked about earlier in the chat about kind of the experience of existentialism in youth and in adolescence. And I think in my own personal experience, growing up and kind of having to come to terms with the existential dread that comes around with mortality and growing up, and just the potential pain of the world and the future is really, it stunts you and is really awful. And then you just know that it's going to be worse and worse and worse. And I think in my own experience, the only thing that brought me out of that and allowed me to kind of put a plan together was taking on potential suffering, facing it head on, finding those skeletons in the closet and cleaning them up, and those things that make you feel uncomfortable, facing those directly, and then making that responsibility grow a little bit more, and then boom, you'll get hit by chaos again. But herein lies the meaning. And so there's a sort of stoic element of facing that suffering and seeing it as the potential for growth. Anti-fragility comes to mind here, Taleb's concept of, think about weightlifting, right? So the more stress you put on your system, the stronger you might possibly be. And we all know those people who have just lived tremendous lives, and they become, such a source of inspiration. So suffering is the path.
Excellent. Thank you, Claire. David, you had a comment about meaning. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
You mean me? Okay. Actually, it's partly a question, because I don't think in this particular week or video, the focus was meaning. It was more about the structure of life having this built-in struggle and denying it being a sort of doomed effort. And in fact, it's healthier to accept and understand the nature of struggle and to integrate that into the way you're living, because that'll give you a certain power over, to recognize that no matter what you're confronted with, if you haven't been eaten by a tiger, chances are you're actually, so you survived. So it's actually, and you will find answers to almost everything that confronts you, or what you think is the negative that has happened has paths of interpretation that still leave you in a way free to define the meaning of your life. But he hasn't really addressed evaluation of what your values are, ordering, priority. He hasn't, I think maybe that's coming in future weeks, you said, nor, in other words, where to build your morals from. Where, okay, God is dead, so clinging to a set of principles that someone hands you is no longer the fashionable way to find security in the world. It's self-reflection, turning into yourself, doubting, and discovering your own meaning. But he hasn't talked about the evaluation and the meaning process. He showed you the destruction of, not the construction of meaning. So, that's now in our hands. We know the answers are not religion per se, utopia per se. It's not that it will be given to us. So we have the work to do. I kind of like that message. I don't really buy the thesis that truth destroyed Christianity. I think Christianity's value was faith above truth. But if you put truth above faith, yes, then you've undermined the structure. But I think that's sort of missing the ontological significance of God and religion and how it functions. So I think in a sense, science can undercut that whole message. And I sort of see that as part of meaning, a different discussion. I'm not sure where we're going with that. So that's where I am.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you. I just want to say one thing. At least Jordan Peterson, the way he approaches values is actually very interesting. He simply says, pursue your values. He doesn't really go and say, okay, define, okay, these are the values you should pursue. Most of his guidance is on virtues, not on values. Like, for example, be honest, face the truth, which are like ways of doing things. And what he's saying is that in the process of pursuing your values, whatever they are, you will actually discover them. So it's like there is this feedback loop of action and evaluation that will build these things up. So instead of let me just complete it and I'll hand it over to you. So instead of saying that a priori, these are the values you should pursue, he's saying that you need to figure out your values. You need to grasp them as, kind of project them, identify them as best as you can, and start working towards them. In the process of working towards them, you're going to suffer, you're going to have failures, you're going to find some of the values you thought your values were, what your values were, but not actually your values. You will discover some other things, you will discover limitations, and that's the process of pursuing meaning. Go ahead, David.
Well, I see him as he looks like a profound and extremely, what's the word, a genius therapist. I don't find that he's beyond that at this higher level of being able to talk about social value, structural meaning, because for the individual alone to do that process, we get Donald Trumps. And I think that's saying, yes, you found your meaning, but I think, so it's not universal. Don't worry about that. I don't think that's good enough. I think what he's begging the question by saying you will find telling the truth is a virtue. Virtues, I think there's something real about virtues. And I think that to say everyone will find their own virtues is a little bit to miss the something. So I'm a little bit of an idealist here.
Thank you, David. Great comments as always. So next is going to be Joe, Maritza, Steven, Moses, James, and Pegor. Joe, go ahead.
I just want to basically explore this idea a little bit more between the link of challenging traditional ways of thinking and moral values, and how that ultimately will lead, if you tear that down, leads to a form of totalitarianism. Because in other parts of Jordan Peterson's book that we've read is that one of the things that I found to be very profound is that people tend not to want to challenge their beliefs in general, and it can be political, doesn't necessarily have to be moral, because there's this form of idea that it upends everything else that they believe, that they start questioning everything else, so therefore they become absolutists. And the link between the two is this idea of how either way we end up with absolutism, right? It's just a question, if we don't question conventional wisdom, that we end up with a totalitarian or absolutist types of, whether it be political beliefs or other forms of belief. So, I mean, I'm just looking to understand a little bit more between this link between if we tore down traditional ways of thinking in religion, that we automatically end up with totalitarianism. Because I don't necessarily, it's hard for me to see that link altogether, like there. You know, I think that it can also lead to something much more pragmatic as well.
Yeah, so he sets up sort of two options. One is totalitarianism, but I would think about it more just sort of any radicalized ideology. And so because there's a lack of some supersedent kind of value structure, it's very easy to fall prey to any of that supersedent structure that might happen. And he's kind of foreshadowing the kind of atrocities of the early 1900s. And then the other option is just straight nihilism, right? Nothing matters. Let's just burn it all down. Why really care? And what existentialism does, as you're, I think, alluding to here, is what's the third option, right? How can we orient ourselves on a new value structure, because we don't need the old one anymore. Like, it served us, but with the dawn of technology, you know, what's the third option? And he kind of sets up this kind of man as almost machine, and encourages us, well, Peterson encourages us to reorient as the individual and set up that value structure, as you're doing ourselves.
Really quickly, just to add to that, is that there's discussions in previous lectures, is the idea that, you know, sometimes other groups are right, you know, nobody's absolutely right. And that's why the importance of dialogue within that process. And that's the third process that I was kind of coming back to from his previous lectures. But thank you.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Joe. Next up is Marisa. Marisa, go ahead.
Hi. I'm feeling a couple different directions. Joe's commentary gave me pause there. I'd like to comment very, very briefly on a few different things. If you just bear with me here a second.
Sure, go ahead. Take your time, Marisa.
Thank you. I view this video as, I see how it is that Peterson tied together these three of our past, influential beings of our past. And so I have three little snippets from each that is what I see he's pulling together. I see what he's taking from Kierkegaard is the necessity of difficulty. From Nietzsche, our being mindful that what we are at presently doing, opining and desiring, is not who we really are. And from Dostoevsky, we should be critical of over-rationality. And if we look at those three little, they're just little sound bites of these like huge philosophical works. I believe that Peterson's point of his lecture was not to focus on meaning. I agree with David on that, but that instead for us to focus on the fact that any blind faith is not our true path. To have any type of rationality, one must question things. But there's the caution of, if you lose faith in any one little thing, now you have the problem of, now you understand that faith can be lost in everything. So everything around you is now questionable. Nietzsche tells us that when we first realize that, we are most in danger, because when we realize that, we have the concern for falling into nihilism, and that would lead us to hopelessness, and that would lead us to some of the things that I saw in the chat where people say, oh, there's no meaning, I have no, why bother if all this is suffering? But the point is not to stay in nihilism. one will acknowledge it and move past it, right? And in doing so, we developed our own guiding mechanism to do so. And once it's ours, we own it. And it's no longer a blind faith. It can still be faith. I mean, I personally, and I'm not sure this was Peterson's view, but I suspect it may be because he has in other lectures, he's talked about his faith. But I believe he's not opposed to the concept of somebody holding on to their faith. He's just asking that you don't hold on to any faith blindly. And so I view the whole point of this lecture is for us to be very, to reject just like any radical non-thinking position, and to accept that all the difficulties in our life are not the highs and they're not the lows. That's the work. That's what you use to propel you forward into a place where you can stand on a foundation where you say, this is my faith because of this reason. So you can take a faith and make it your own, but you can't do that without acknowledging the difficulty and the suffering.
Oh, that
Thank
was
you.
wonderful. Claire, do you mind if I make a comment and then hand it over to you? Okay. So this is fantastic. I think this is kind of the core of Nietzsche, you know, how he approaches things. See, most people kind of outsource this process of discovering your faith. They just take something off the shelf. They'll say, okay, this is my faith. This is not something that they have actually earned. This is not something that they have struggled with. They have tried to figure out. They say, oh, this is the answer. Just give me the answer, okay? And that is empty. That is empty. So the way I see it, I don't see this as nihilism at all. In fact, I see it exactly opposite. I see it as actually seeing the glory of an individual life, where you are authentically actually trying to pursue values. You're authentically trying to figure out your life. And that is a hard process. You know, life is very complex. We are very complex. There is a lot of uncertainty all around, a lot of chaos. And you're trying to build some order out of it. And that process is hard. But that is what gives life meaning. And kind of suffering and failure is the process through which you actually learn. So when you look at somebody over a period of time, right, it's not, they typically, you know, when they look back at life, they don't regret their failures, because those failures actually are giving you the feedback to correct yourself, to kind of point yourself the right way. And you build yourself. So it's, to me, it is kind of pointing towards glory of an individual life. And this process is the process of living. So in that sense, most of the ideals that have been presented to human beings in the past are static ideals. Those are not actually living. Those are pictures. Those are like you take a snapshot of something and say, that's, but life is not a snapshot. Life is this process. And that's what Jordan Peterson or Nietzsche focus on. So that's my take. Claire, your thoughts?
And I think this beautifully summarizes the core element here. And, you know, you could call it a map of meaning, right? And there's a reason it's called maps of meaning, and there isn't just one map, because we all have a unique map that's built on our past as well as our value structure. And that map is going to hit a dragon. It's going to hit a roadblock. It's inevitable that it will hit suffering or something that will turn your understanding of the world on its head, but is the process of continually redrawing that map that the juice is made.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marisa. That was just great. Next up is Moses, James, Pegor, and Aaron. Moses, go ahead.
Thank you, Shrikant. I learned a lot from this video, but from my takeaways, like, how do I practically implement the words, like the works of Jordan Peterson, Nietzsche, and the Russian author into my life? Like, how do I profit from the suffering that I experience in my life, and how do I pays ultimately? So it's a big topic, and Nietzsche, he's like he has written many books, he's very famous, and the point is, like, I find that how do I get stronger, how do I get better in my life, and especially from failures in my life, because everybody failed some point in their life and they suffered miserably, and they eventually come to a point of existential crisis, and they ask a lot of questions like, what is the point of living, what's the point of all this suffering? And and this led me to think, is, okay, what do I do, how do I bring order into my life? And that is what Jordan Peterson talks a lot about in his lectures, that is to form a routine, is to clean up your room and tidy up your bed, and all those good stuff. So the point is, like, how do you profit from suffering and not to suffer pointlessly in life? I mean, that's what my question is.
Yeah, I think there's two elements here. The first one you already hit, which is this sort of cleanup process, right? It's an auditing process in which we take a hard look at our lives and our values and our potential for vice and our potential for malevolence and evil, as well as our potential for virtue. And we really project those into the future and understand them and not avoid our potential for malevolence. And then, as you said, clean our rooms and rectify the relationships with the people we love, and everything that makes us uncomfortable, really try to rectify that so that we can operate in a place of truth going forward. And then, as you say, as we come into suffering and we hit it, and we inevitably will, having, Peterson offers us some tools to rectify that. The first is truth telling, right? That in conversation with others and with ourselves, what through that be journaling or just truth thinking, if we can go through that experience through a place of truth, or at least not lying, we will come to grapple with some sort of understanding. And that grappling only happens, though, when we are paying deep attention to that which we are experiencing. And so when we're hit with suffering, looking at it truthfully and paying, intense attention to all elements of that. He uses the example in a breakup, really, inevitable thing. It's very painful, but really piercing out and trying to understand and grapple with, where are there temperamental differences? What happened here? What conversations went on? And the eyesight, the attention will be that guide to kind of reformulate that map when the going gets tough.
Moses, I want to add one thing. The core answer of Jordan Peterson on that is his concept of meaning. And we will be doing a 13-part series on this book, Maps of Meaning, which looks at all this particular issue. How do you discover your own meaning? What is involved in the process in great amount of detail, starting 2 weeks from now. All right, so that's what's coming up. Next up is James, Pegor, and Aaron. James, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering, Nietzsche has a quote where he says, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger." So in that quote, that suggests that there's a lot of suffering, right? If you're close to death, that means that you're probably hurt and suffering, but it makes you stronger. So is there a kind of meaning in that too? That if that out of the struggle, in life, there's a meaning in feeling that strength, right? That power in yourself, right? It's kind of individual meaning. But on the other hand, it's not a full-blown kind of meaning with that you could be happy with, satisfied with. because in Camus, you know, he has this myth of the Sisyphus is rolling a rock up the mountain, and then he's doing that for eternity to capture what life is all about. That it's always a struggle, but I don't think he was satisfied. Camus was satisfied with that struggle as a kind of would give him you know, a fullness of the meaning that he later on captures in the book the Plague, right, where he joins others in solidarity to you know, overcome the plague, to be part of, you know, the struggle with other people, and that's a more full-blown kind of meaning, which maybe that's what he was alluding to.
I'll just make one comment because many people have raised this issue in the chat. I think, you know, how much of suffering is bearable? You know, there is a suffering beyond which, you know, we are living beings. We kind of go back towards homeostasis. And so how much suffering is necessary, or how much suffering is good for you? Or what is too much suffering? Okay, there is something as too much suffering, I think. And again, the answer to this is Jordan Peterson's concept of meaning. That is kind of moving, you know, he puts it in terms of order and chaos. If you throw yourself into chaos completely, where you're completely disoriented and you lose all sense of order, that is actually not good for you. Just like if you stay completely within order and shy away from any kind of chaos, that's also not good for you. That is static. You're going to start dying through just inaction and kind of just deterioration. What you need some amount of chaos. So you have to kind of calibrate how much of chaos you can take, but that continuous contact with chaos is necessary for growth. So that is the concept that he uses to calibrate the amount of suffering. Next up, let me see, I lost people here. Give me a second. Next up is Pegor, followed by Aaron, and then we're going to do breakout rooms. Oh, yeah, that's right. Pegor, followed by Aaron, and then we're going to do breakout rooms. Pegor, go ahead.
Okay, so I want to talk about 2 points. The first point is the question that came up earlier of like, do we set up our own values and that? And what I've noticed Peterson say, and I think he says this from his clinical experience, is initially like people aren't playing the game even. So he says like, you set up your values and play the game with your values. And then sort of the implication is that once you get going, then you can sort of bring in sort of maybe religious values or some other community values to apply to yourself. So that's the first point. The second point is regarding the question of like when Nietzsche said that God is dead and we killed him, so to speak, and the Christian insistence on truth and which led to the death of God. I think, and that he then says that then we're going to have to find our own values. I think the solution to that problem is that we pursue truth, but we pursue truth in the material world, truth of the material world, whereas there's also truth in the world of being, as Peterson says. And so if we transfer sort of the Christian insistence of truth from the material world to the world of being, we can sort of resurrect God. And that could be an out for us as human beings of having to decide our own values.
Claire, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely spot on. And yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head.
Excellent. Aaron, you're next.
Yeah, great presentation, guys. Huge fan of Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, but I think both of those writers kind of get this a little bit wrong when they say God is dead and so forth. I think they're referring to the Christian God and they're referring to Judeo-Christian values as the whole. And a philosopher that never really gets talked about all that much is a guy by the name of Baruch Spinoza. And he had this idea of God being a part of the universe, like kind of outside of the religious confines. And a lot of people run with this and think, oh, well, there is no God, therefore straight to nihilism, straight to atheism. But there is like another world to exist in. Like there could be what Einstein would refer to as the Spinoza God, a God of the universe.
Aaron, let's do one thing. We'll do a special meetup on Spinoza. Spinoza's distance from existentialists is very, very large. So we will go ahead and do a special one on Spinoza. Do you want to just recap what you want to say about Spinoza so that it distinguishes it from existentialism? Because I want to
what like just to touch upon what people are saying is that a lot of people are saying like more Christian morality might be dead, and that might be very well true. Like that is true. But I think that Christian morality and God are two separate entities. And then that's just what I'm kind of pointing out here.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Aaron. So folks, what we're going to do is that we're going to do breakout rooms for exactly 20 minutes. And then we will come back here. And that is the time when you get to ask your most important question about this topic. Okay, so that's what I'm going to ask for, the best question that you have on this topic. All right, I'm starting the breakout rooms now. Welcome back, everyone. Hi, Claire. So what I want to do is I want to give an opportunity for everybody to ask the biggest question that they have, okay, that they would like to put on the table. I want to just put questions on the table. That questions that was inspired by this topic, related to this topic. And once we have all the questions, we'll try to arrange all of them and we'll try to discuss as much of it, especially the big patterns that emerge from it. All right, so it's going to be, I'm going to call on people in the order in which I see people. If you don't want to ask the question, you can go ahead and type skip. And I will skip. So questions, only questions, okay? So it's going to be Jairo, Jean, and Kevin next. Jairo, go ahead. What's your question?
Yes, thank you. So what if there were now I understand, I get that the big guys in existentialism, it sounds like they were in a period that there was a lot of suffering going on. So I'm thinking that it was so prevalent that they only wrote about it because that's all they saw. So what if there were a period, or there are many periods, perhaps in the US in the 50s or so, when there was a lot of joy. And so what if those existentialists were writing in a period where there was a lot of, instead of suffering, just joy? So wouldn't they write that they would say life is joy, and that we should pursue it, and we should develop more joy, and by like going after it, we will become stronger? Isn't that like the American dream?
Got it. So your question is that, is the existential philosophy the result of the suffering that they lived through, or is it something else? Next question is by Jean.
Yeah, our group, when we discussed also about the suffering, and we were actually end up as a question, what is suffering? How we define it. Is that this satisfaction is suffering, or is like physical or psychological suffering? What's really suffering? Maybe to one person is suffering, to another person is nothing. So what's really suffering?
Excellent, excellent. So what is suffering? All right, so that was second question. Next question is by Kevin. Kevin, what's your question?
I guess we got a similar question with Jane, Judy, and Joseph. Also, what's the definition for of suffering? Here's from, let's see, religious beliefs and a personal level. Well, that's, if we have a good definition of suffering, I guess we got an answer, half answer for the question, suffering.
Sure.
Thank you.
Excellent. Next up is Mike. Mike, what's your question? Mike, it's going to be Mike, Moses, and David. Mike?
Okay, what was the role of truth and operation of people as a herd effect rather than he considered the people as a herd of wild animals that operated in out direction, and I thought that was a major trend. And how does that fit in, even toward suffering, even toward our inability to take up major projects because of fear? So that herd effect was to the advantage or disadvantage.
Okay, excellent. So, so the question is about herd mentality. What is the connection between herd mentality and suffering? Okay, very good. Next up is Judith. Anybody who wants to ask questions, if you want to put your questions down, you can go ahead and put an exclamation mark, and I will put you ahead in the line for putting the exclamation mark. So Judith, go ahead. What's your question?
So we did talk about in our group what is suffering, but I just wanted to add to that, like, then what is the existentialist view of what is to be done with suffering?
Okay.
Something we lean into, or what?
Okay, what should we do with suffering? Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, next up is Moses, David, and Stephen. Moses. Okay, next up is David Roller. You have a question, David?
One of the questions that I guess I would ask is do we see a structure for the, as Peterson related, is the balance between order and chaos, and the need to actually have them interrelating with each other to either move forward in your life positively, or will it have a negative effect on your life?
I want to make sure I understand. So are you saying what is the proper relationship between order and chaos? Is that what you're asking?
Well, no, the need for the order and chaos and the balance.
Need for both order and chaos, that's what you're asking?
A balance between order
balance.
and chaos.
Okay, got it. Need for balance. Got it. Excellent. Next up is Stephen, Paul S, and Aaron. Stephen. Oh, you skipped. Okay, that's fine. Paul, what's your question? Paul, you need to unmute yourself. Nope. Okay. Paul, I can't hear you. All right. Next up is Aaron. Paul, do you have a question or no?
Which Paul?
Hmm?
Which Paul?
No, you, Paul S.
Sorry, because you said, okay, how to get people to study and read more so I don't have to suffer as much.
Okay, all right, got it. Very interesting. Next up is Aaron, Maritza, and David S. Aaron, go ahead.
Actually, I just wanted to quickly shout out Maritza. She kind of inspired this question I'm about to ask, so thank you. The question I want to ask is, we were discussing about living just for survival and living with like a purpose. And I'm wondering if it's ever appropriate to chastise people who don't live with purpose. Like, we seem to be very accepting of people who don't have purpose and that they just like to just eat and lay on the couch or whatever. Should we as a society start chastising them a bit more?
Okay, very good. Without purpose. All right. Next up is Maritza, David S, and Laura. Maritza, go ahead.
Hi. I was curious about an aspect that we hadn't quite covered here yet today. I'm curious about where we would look at the dissonance that would be created in viewing the existentialist point of view where crowd is untruth, where we look at, it creates a dissonance of action versus accountability. So how do we reconcile that? Because if where existentialism is about focusing on the individual, we still have, we have to somehow identify that the crowd doesn't automatically go away. It's still there.
So individual pursuit versus or related to the crowd, right? How do you relate? Okay, very good. And crowd. Okay, very good. Next up is David S., Laura, and William. David?
I might skip, thanks.
Okay. Next up is Laura, William, and Julie.
Me?
Laura, you have a question?
Yeah, well, I guess I'm having difficulty trying to form it exactly, but do the ends of the questions, the existential questions, one way or the other, have to have sort of a finite response? I mean, have a finite end so that there can be a response? Can it be indefinite?
Okay, indefinite.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks. Definite answer. Next up is William, Julie, and Joe. William?
Hi. It seems like the existentialists are saying that we get meaning through suffering, but are they implying that we need to suffer as much as we can? Is that what they're saying? That we need to just choose the worst kind of suffering ever? That seems kind of crazy, and I don't think that's what Peterson his point is. Thanks.
Excellent. So do we need to suffer as much as we can? Okay, let's put it that way. Next up is Julie, Joe, and Dave. Julie, go ahead.
Yeah, in our group, we did point out that luckily this isn't a course of, weekly thing on existentialism, because they don't really provide a whole lot of alternatives to suffering and finding meaning in it. And luckily this is a course on Jordan Peterson, so he's going to have more to say. My question would be, what would they think of something like love? It seems to me that they do have a high regard for rather than intuition or any of that other stuff. That's my question. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Intuition. What would they think about intuition? Okay. All right. Next up is Joe, Dave, and Jeff. Joe?
That intuition actually question was really great actually in the video as well. That was something that had come up earlier. But I'm inspired actually by something Maritza had said as well, as the idea of this existential angst, and that there is this period of recognition that we go through, that initially the absurdity of life, and then how that is handled. How does one handle the initial understanding of the absurdity of life? And then I also think another question, if I may add, maybe just something along the lines of, is the authentic life always liberating?
Okay. Very good. Next up is, I think I lost the order again. Jeff. Jeff, go ahead.
So, relationship is a very rich topic, but it does occur to me that a lot of the focus of these philosophers does seem to me to be on the experience of the individual, and I'm curious regarding the extension of it, not only to one's experience of these things and orientation of these things in groups, but also the orientation to a society as a whole.
Excellent. So I'll put that along with the other question that I think somebody else had put in, crowd and individual. So individual and the crowd or society. How does that fit in? Perfect. Dave, sorry I missed you. See, what happens in Zoom is that people keep moving around and I lose track of them. Dave,
We're like-
go ahead.
We're like dancing, but yeah, thanks, Shrikant. Yeah, it's, as I said, this video was a real downer for me because I have a theory of improving lives. And my question is, can government improve the lives of our people? I know Jordan Peterson looks at revolutions in Russia and China as more or less destroying their countries. I know he's very pessimistic about that, but that to me is one of my great interests. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next up is Pegor, Tricia, and Brian.
Yeah, so first of all, I'd just like to say thank you to you and Claire for prepping this talk for today. And my question, I guess, would be is how easy is it, or can we even possibly set up something like a 5-step program or a 12-step program to help people out of existential dread? Like, because like, I don't think everyone can like stomach watching a hour-and-a-half video of Peterson and adjacent content to sort of understand how to sort of begin digging themselves out of that.
Okay, very good. So the 12-step process. Okay, all right, very nice. Next up is Tricia, Brian, and Marianne.
So my question is mainly the issue of God being dead because of existentialism or Christianity killing itself. Jesus as a person, whether he was a deity or not, or a God or anything, the teachings of the New Testament are very existential, in my opinion. And so the question there is, are we mistaking organized religion as being against existentialism and projecting that onto an actual set of teachings in a book?
Excellent, excellent point. Excellent point. I think Jordan Peterson would certainly agree that all of these, most of these issues are dealt with in religion in a different form. So excellent point. Next up is Brian, Marian, and Victor. Brian, go ahead. Brian, you need to unmute if you want to speak. Okay, next up is Victor. Victor followed by Diana. Victor, go ahead.
Right. Well, thank you so much, guys. Wonderful discussion today. I picked up a few things on faith and existentialism itself. My question would be, do existentialists make a difference, well, draw a difference between suffering as is and suffering for? Meaning,
no, can you repeat? I missed that. Please, can you repeat?
Well, the idea is, do existentialists make a difference, make a differentiation between the idea of suffering for the sake of suffering and suffering for, meaning suffering in the process of and suffering as itself as a destination.
Got it. Okay, very good, excellent. Let's see, who else? I want to check, make sure that, okay, I'll just call on you folks. If you've already put a skip, then just remain silent and I'll go to the next person. So I see Moses, Jyoti, and Sean. Moses, do you have a question?
So my question is, since life is all about suffering, so how do I enjoy suffering?
Okay.
Make it more interesting.
Okay, very good. Jyoti, what's your question?
My question was skipped, but that's okay.
Okay.
I can ask you a question.
Sure.
If the suffering is in the high eye of the beholder, then why should become a suffering?
Okay. Very good. Let's see. Who else? Sean, Sean and Martin, did you guys want to ask a question? I'm going to give 5 seconds to you. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go to the next person.
Can you
All right.
repeat what Jyoti just said, please?
Jyoti, can you repeat your question again?
Oh, I said if the suffering is perceived by individuals, then why it should be even a suffering?
Okay.
Like if it's a matter of perception,
Right.
then
Is it
why
in the
it
eye
should
of the
even-
beholder?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's basically what I'm saying.
Okay. All right. So now we have questions on the table. So Claire, this is very amazing questions, don't you think?
Fantastic. And a really wide range, I think.
Yes. So here is what how I was planning to kind of break it up. So one is a question of, there are lots of questions about the nature of suffering itself. We have to take them first.
Yeah.
And then there is a bunch of questions about individual suffering and kind of suffering in a society, or how does, how does this experience of a individual that we've been talking about, we've been focusing on, relate to others. So I think those are the two kind of large things, patterns that come in. So in terms of, let's talk about suffering first. So let me list all the things that people have said, people have raised. So first is just, what is suffering? How do you define suffering? Second is that this focus on suffering that we find in existentialism, is it the result of the fact that they faced a lot of suffering in their life, therefore they're talking about it this way? Or is there some other reason for that? So let's take that one first. I mean, I would say that, that way of thinking about suffering is quite independent of, I mean, it may be motivated by some of the actual suffering that they have done, but their point is not that if you are in such a situation, then suffering is an issue. But it's a much more kind of, it's a metaphysical point. It's about human condition itself. So it's much larger than any particular specific context. So that's all I would like to say about this. So the question is, what is suffering? Then how should we handle suffering? In particular, when we initially see the absurdity of life, or when we find that the ideas that we are holding on to, we find suddenly discover for the first time that they are empty. How do you handle that? How do you start with that? What should we do with suffering? Is it about suffering for the sake of suffering, or is it for suffering for a purpose? Then is it that you should try to suffer as much as you can? Is that the idea? Let me see. How do you overcome the existential dread? Can we come up with a 12-step process of handling suffering? So these are some of the things that were put on the table. So how about you start talking about some of them, then I will add to some of them, and then we will open it up. So we are discussing, folks, now the discussion is about the nature of suffering, and we will just take these different questions. So let's start with the simplest, the core one. What is suffering? What do they mean by suffering, Claire?
Yeah, so It's a lived experience that involves our actions and how we interact with the world. And so Peterson uses the example of the suffering that a child, a baby feels when you take a candy away from it and it's crying. That suffering is just as real to that individual as, someone losing a family member later in life. And so suffering has this very embodied quality that leads to its kind of reality and meaning. Peterson also says that suffering really is one of the only fundamental truths that we can know about the world. It's the only thing that we know to be truly real and fundamentally kind of true across all of us. And then therefore, his path toward meaning, or the only way to combat that, is the alleviation of suffering. And I think herein lies kind of the tool. So it's a lived and embodied and really relative experience to us.
Sure. The way I think about this is that I really think in terms of chaos and order as a primary kind of metaphysical or epistemological thing. Suffering is the kind of experience of it. So I always think of it as a derived, it's like the experiential concomitant of the kind of action or epistemological equivalent of kind of order and chaos. So all the questions I kind of answer it, I think about them in terms of this idea of order and chaos. So what is suffering? Suffering is basically your experience of encountering chaos. And the how much suffering is it suffering for the sake of suffering? You don't go to chaos just for the sake of chaos. You go to the chaos in order to reorder it, to create a greater order. So that is the purpose for the sake, because if you remained in order and refuse to and run away from suffering, any kind of difficulty, then you will never grow. And for the sake of growth, and you will be bored out of your mind over time, and you will start to decay and not live. So in order to live, you have to face the chaos, and the experience of facing the chaos is suffering. And you do whatever you can handle, the more, and you have to be at the limit. For example, if dealing with the chaos is too easy for you, then you're not dealing with the chaos enough. You have to push yourself. At the same time, you should not throw yourself into chaos up to a point where you lose that. That was the idea of balance that somebody brought up, David brought up, of what is the balance, and it's all about that balance. And it is that balance is calibrated by you, by the individual. In different areas of your life, you will actually tolerate more or less. Just like Jean was talking about, the capacity of ability to handle suffering varies from person to person. So also the ability to handle chaos varies. So I always think primarily in terms of chaos and order, because that is kind of more grounded, more kind of objective. And then I look at suffering as a part of that. And it goes across the thing. What does it mean to find the initial absurdity or feel the existential dread? Is to realize that the order that you were counting on is not all that there is. And you kind of see the limits of it, and you say, okay, I cannot just live with just this. I need to widen my scope. And that discovery that you must face chaos is about that. About a 12-step process, let's come to later on. I don't know whether we'll have a good answer to that, but let's open it up to questions, or not questions, but any thoughts about suffering at a very deep level. So it's going to be Aaron, followed by Joe. Aaron, go ahead.
Yeah, so I largely agree with what you just said, Shrikant. I usually go to the Buddhist understanding that life is suffering, and the way that I kind of see that is that when you just say life is suffering, it really takes away all of the entitlement of when bad things happen to you. Like people, oh my God, like why is this happening to me, God? Why is this happening to me? But if your basic maximum is that life is suffering, you're like, oh, some suffering. Great, that's life. And like once you fundamentally make that determination that that life is just 100% suffering at all times, it will always be there, it will always pop in there, and that if pleasure just, you know, it's like, it's actually pleasure that's like the random thing that you should be grateful for, but most of the time it's suffering. And once you make that recalibration that like most of life is suffering, then you're not ruminating and kind of lamenting and asking the heavens why you're suffering. You're like, oh, well, this is exactly what life is. Life is exactly this thing, and occasionally some pleasure comes my way. That's awesome. But if you make that recalibration that life is just constant suffering, you're not pessimistic or upset all the time. You're actually a lot happier because you actually realize this is you're getting exactly what you expect to get.
Thanks, Aaron. I mean, see, this is another reason I like to always think in terms of order and chaos first, because what happens is that once you accept that there is going to be chaos, that, you know, life has chaos in it, and actually that is good for you, even the way you experience suffering is very different. Like, I think the most problem people have is that they suffer because they are suffering. Like, it's the fear of fear. Like, if you kind of take that into your strides, you just see it's as kind of an integral part of life itself, and you don't really kind of think of it. You say, oh, this means that I'm moving into chaos a little bit more than what I can usually handle, and that's what is going on. So once you have that perspective, it doesn't really look that bad to you. You know, you kind of take it as kind of regular part of life. Next up is Joe, Marisa, Jyoti, Claire, and Victor. Joe, go ahead.
Actually, Aaron just kind of changed what I was even going to say a little bit, because I just want to just build a little bit off of that, is that the idea that once you have this understanding that life is suffering, you also recognize that you're not the only one that is suffering. And that's a really important point, because then you don't feel alone. So that's, you know, one thing. It helps you get outside yourself and to understand the human experience in a much more authentic way. But I do think that there's another aspect to this too. I think that there are different levels of authenticity that one can engage with. I think it is on a scale. And I equate it to somebody that, you know, is sometimes, and I can think about it in terms of somebody that's drafted to the military, right? Some people can go into war and some people just can't. It's just not in them. And it's kind of, I feel like the same thing with living an authentic life, is that some people just definitely can't go all the way and just can't, you know, experience, you know, and how then the question is, how do you then ground yourself and embrace this chaos that you now begin to realize? And I do think that virtue ethics is one form of one framework that can actually work with developing a way of handling the chaos and the absurdity of life. I think that the other way is that you can take psychological approaches of embracing your fears and how you embrace your fears. And, you know, there are various ways to do that. And this gets to Pergore's question a little bit. You know, perhaps there's a framework you can put together in order to help you, you know, again, live a more authentic life. But I do think, I do caution, because I do know a lot of people that probably would not be able to accept that type of life. And not only would they not accept it, but how they embrace it could actually be, it could turn to evil. You know, there are the examples of the Columbine shooters that he uses, that once you become this nihilist, that life is meaningless, you know, you go the other way. That's another aspect of it. So, and then there's just degrees that people can handle. So anyway, I rambled on long enough for that.
Thank you, Joe. Next up is Marisa, Jyoti, Claire, Victor, Kevin, and David S. Marisa, go ahead.
So Nietzsche tells us that life is suffering, but he also reminds us that it's an osmotic relationship, that between, you know, it's like you can't have one without the other. You can't have joy without sadness. You can't have, you know, exaltation without suffering. Like you in order to achieve one, you must have the other. So if we reject suffering and we seek to nothing someone or something or even ourselves, then we are also rejecting the opposite. So I did mention in my group chat that, you know, Peterson tells us if you have no goals, then you have no positive emotions, and then you have nowhere for the negative emotions to go. So it's like, you know, you can call it, you know, I say osmotic relationship, but if you want to think slightly more spiritually, there's the yin, the yang, you know, that if we look at even your model, Shrikant, I can see this fitting in your, you know, self versus others, or the opposing polarities, you know, they're both required. I do want to take a quick moment to say to Joe, just a response to something Joe said, I have to respectfully disagree. I don't think it's a true statement that some people can't handle this life. You know, it's a subjective choice. Some people are not willing to embrace this life. Some people are not willing to do what is required to be along this path. Or again, they want one end without realizing that tagging along for the ride is going to be the flip. You can't have one without the other. And some people want to break. And when you break it, you create an unattainable situation, which, you know, like nihilism, you know, all three of these philosophers warn us that that's not where we want to be, but that's somewhere you can find yourself if you just find yourself listless. Thank you.
Thank you, Marisa. I have to say that you always have amazing things to say. So I need you to do a meetup for us on any topic of your interest. Let's plan on doing that. You know, pick any topic, because it's you always have great comments. Thank you. Next up is Jyoti, Claire, Victor, Kevin, and David S. Jyoti, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. I agree with Aaron about the theory of acceptance. The more you accept what is coming in your life, the easier it is for you to cope with it. But how about a person who's born with a disability or an autistic child and the parents of the autistic children? When the parents are totally helpless, they can't help their child and they see day in and day night that the child is deteriorating. How do you accept that? You know, that to me is a real suffering. I mean, you know, I become a widow and I'm suffering, but I know one thing, that's just how it is in life. But how do you tell an autistic parent that this is how it is in life?
Yeah, no, I mean, there are situations, certainly. I mean, you know, you can be in that situation. You can be in a terrible political situation in some of these countries that, you know, people have lived through. And absolutely. Next up is Claire. Claire, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to bring up the last rule, Rule 12, which I think is actually a beautiful response to your question, Jyoti, which is pet a cat when you encounter one on the street. I always think of this when I see Dave's cat crawl up to encounter Dave. But the rule here is that despite the misery, we can find beautiful glimmers of beauty and joy and that resistance to suffering. And that is what Peterson really encouraged us to pay attention to. A fantastic tool in times of really deep tragedy is to shrink your timeline. And so if you can't make it through this week, can you make it through today? If you can't make it through today, can you make it through this hour? And then in that amount of time, what beauty can you find? What glimmer of hope or joy can you kind of cling on to? And if you use that tool, you will survive. Humans are exceptionally strong. Just as much suffering exists, the resistance to that suffering also exists in contrast. And so finding that beauty in the little things really exists as the antidote to that pain.
That's a great point, Claire. Beautiful. One person I would recommend is Viktor Frankl, and his experiences in concentration camp and how he lived through it and how he grew in that context. It's always been stunning to me, a stunning example of how people can handle kind of really, really horrible context and come out strong as a result of it. Next up is Victor.
Well, thank you so much, guys. I really enjoyed it. And I just want to say I like the definition that suffering is the experience of it, that hits home to me. So that's all I wanted to say. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Victor. Let's see who's next. Give me a second. Next one is Kevin. Kevin, go ahead.
Yes, my comment about takeaways about surfing is sometimes I think about it's like experience. It's better you have early rather than later if it depends. It's have fun with life. The kids like play, I don't know, learn. Later on, you got a hard time. Bring your life back. My teeth, let's see another example. Let's say my teeth is pain. That time I'm going to miss the time, the moment my tooth is not pain. So I would say use the term positive acceptance to dealing with suffering. For definition of suffering, after I pose question, first the various personal level, it's you need to define this suffering for your person. It's real. It's real maybe for the moment. How about like an hour later or after a day? You learn from something. So something is not something not too bad. Practicing the positive acceptance could prepare live the change world where what the next happen we cannot control.
Thank you, Kevin. Next up is David S. followed by Judith. David, go ahead.
Right, Shrikant, when you said that suffering was a confrontation with chaos, I just wanted to point at it's the confrontation. It's the response to that confrontation, and it's when you're not totally prepared, which is why you're finding it chaotic. So it's your unpreparedness in a state of confrontation with the world that is chaotic, which means it's revealing to you there's something you don't understand or haven't been prepared to integrate. And according to Peterson's theory, we're exactly built to integrate experience, no matter what it is. We may not be ready for this one, but okay, so as we integrate it, that means this is a learning. This is something new for us. So suffering is good because it gave the opportunity. It was the indication that we had something right here in front of us to learn. And I thought about, okay, the good of suffering, but how do we apply this to something like the loss that you feel? And so it's always, the answer is always, well, the reason you feel all this pain and this loss is because it's based on the love that was chaotically removed. And if you felt the constant presence of that love, if you were prepared for that in your life, that this is only temporary, and you had that, that sort of, there's a lesson that you weren't prepared with. And so the end of life is natural in that sense, and it's less chaotic in that way, and the suffering can be a lesson like that.
Yes, no, that was a great point. I mean, a lot of Stoic philosophy is about that, of kind of projecting, saying, okay, this might happen, and kind of mentally preparing yourself for that, and taking that into account so that, that as a tool for doing that. Next up is Judith, followed by Laura. Judith, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just wanted to follow up with what you had said, Shrikant, what Joyati brought up, what Claire responded to. You know, when you have personal experiences of suffering then that are imposed on you, like, you know, an autistic child, I think she mentioned, it's not just that you are looking for glimmers of joy elsewhere or, you know, hopeful things that way. The experience, the very specific experience of that suffering can give you such a unique perspective um, that others wouldn't have, or that most others wouldn't have. And within that unique perspective, you see the world in a different way. And if you overcome it, then, well, the process of overcoming it involves courage and all kinds of other things you know, really depends on what the suffering is. But those lessons that you take forward, they're like kind of like gifts. So they're those, from there you can find joys too. So within suffering, there can be something deeper than just, oh, isn't this horrible? It's hard to know when you're in it, but it's good to remember that, and maybe look for that, you know, because if you have an autistic child and you're struggling with certain aspects of that, or, you know, that child might bring a kind of joy to you that other children don't bring to their parents, you know, or you might gain a perspective of like, uh, a, you know, the pleasure of helping others in a similar situation. Just multiple things that I can't even envision, but I just believe that within that suffering that there are, there is something, there's joy within that that's possible as an outcome of it, maybe.
Excellent, excellent point, Judith. I mean, the way I think about it is that, you know, anybody who handles suffering well, they add to their character. So their character is much more kind of stronger, richer, more complex, more able in some way to handle life as a result of it. So it's like the results are built into your character, of your way of operating. If you face it well, if you deal with it well, and that's kind of, you know, your kind of virtue grows as a result of it, which you carry with you.
Thank you. I agree 100%. I couldn't have said it better. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. Next up,
Sorry, Shrikant. I had to make this comment and I have to leave now. I understand what you said. The suffering can make you strong and your character can become strong. I have suffered all my life. That's another story for another day. And people call me, "Well, you are very strong. We have never seen a woman like yourself." But I'll tell you one thing, suffering never goes away.
yes,
I'm still suffering.
yes.
I have become strong to handle the life, but the suffering part never goes away. All right. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you, Jyoti. Good night. Next up is Laura, Julie, Jean, and Kevin. Laura, go ahead.
Okay, this might be a little offbeat, but I think one of my anecdotes to suffering is humor. And I like to laugh a lot because I think that that's what makes me feel much better through the course of the day. But I also like to make other people laugh because I think it will help them. And I do that. That's one of my goals. Every time I speak to some administrative person on the phone, I always make them laugh and I always leave them laughing. And that's, you know, that's what I do to get through my suffering in the course of a day. And when I don't laugh enough, I don't feel well.
Okay, thank you.
So
Thank you.
that's it.
Next up is Julie,
Good
Jean,
night.
and Kevin. Julie.
I don't know why this comes to mind. Would you rather be a satisfied pig or a dissatisfied human? I'm surprised he doesn't talk about resistance and acceptance more, because resistance causes a lot of our self-inflicted pain, suffering. And I guess the reason the reason why they don't, those sheep and the cattle that follow people around, they don't put that up there high, but that would be like denial of the truth. And so can you be out of suffering when you're in denial? And wouldn't they maybe respect it if you chose to go that route? I think they just put a high virtuous on accepting this negative thing and living despite it. And I don't know that that's the only alternative. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Julie. Next up is Jean. Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to mention about the suffering, like how I understand when your kids or like have some problem, and I think the parents suffer more than kids actually is. I remember I saw this pastor from Australia or somewhere. When he was born, he doesn't have legs, arms, anything. And he gave speech all over the world. It's very inspiring. Like he can even skateboard. It's fascinating how when people don't born with it, they don't really complain. They just take it and they deal with it, and they actually do more. I can't believe. I know people like without arms, they skateboard. I can't even skateboard myself. So it's like, how did the people do this? And I actually realized when you don't have something, you pressures what you have more than you have everything. So that's actually the bonus for people who are suffering, because they appreciate what they have and actually take to the next level to deal with what they have.
Wonderful. Let's go to, I know there are more questions, but more comments, but let's go to the next topic because I don't want it to go for too long. But the next topic was something that many people brought up, and it is really fascinating. So I want to deal with it in some way. So this is about individual and society. How does suffering work in the social context, in the group context, with the crowd? How does everything that we are saying about the individual experience, how does it apply when we are social beings, we are operating in the middle of others? So what are your thoughts about that? Claire?
Yeah, I would love to hear Maritza talk a little bit about the crowd, because it's a philosophical piece that I'm still grappling with. So I think that's great. But I think just in the basic sense, life is suffering. We know that's true. So the only possible thing we have to do about it is to alleviate suffering. In my experience, that has to start with yourself. So outputting and helping others suffering while you're still grappling with some sort of internal conflict will not work. So how can you come to that internal peace? And then when you are in a position where you're strong enough to very carefully try to alleviate the suffering of someone around you, I found it most effective to start by leading by example. You certainly cannot ever tell someone what to do. You cannot change someone if they're not actively ready to do that. And so showing up, I feel often with that authenticity is quite meaningful. And then I love what was said earlier, which was just be nice to your barista. If you have the confidence to feel centered and alleviate suffering yourself, you're going to be a little bit nicer to the bus driver and the person that you pass. And so those little moments of smiles can become petting a cat for another person that might really need that.
Wow, wonderful. So Maritza, I'm going to come to you, but let's go to Pegor, Tricia, David, and then you. Okay, Pegor, go ahead.
Yeah, so what I would like to say about this topic is I don't think that a crowd or a society in itself can suffer. Individuals comprising that society suffer because in the hierarchy of being, it's the individual, and then above the individual comes the society. So it is the individual that gives potentiality and rise to the society. And since society isn't conscious the same way as we are, I understand like Jung has the collective unconscious, but that's an unconscious. It's not a conscious. So I don't think societies or crowds can suffer in and of themselves, because if you flip every single individual in that crowd from a suffering state to a state of non-suffering, let's say, then the crowd cannot stay in a suffering state. It automatically collapses back into a sort of a non-suffering crowd.
Excellent point. Next up is Tricia. Tricia, go ahead.
I think that the crowd thing is very interesting. So if you even look at it from like a psychological perspective, there are all these experiments about how people's individual perceptions of concrete physiological things will change and be swayed by the crowd. And I think what existentialism posits is that in order to embrace this philosophy, you have to embrace being existentially alone. And I think in order to do that, you almost, well, it's already been said, it's like a rejection of the crowd hive mind. But then the question that someone just asked, like, how do you like reintegrate, or how do you integrate it at all? I think it is being authentic. I think it is suffering well. And I think that if you even just do those two things, it will help other people without you even actively trying to help. So whoever asked that, hopefully that's a position that you can consider.
Excellent, Tricia. That was great. Next up is David.
Okay, so I'll piggyback or stand on Tricia's shoulders and try to continue with that idea that existentially we are alone. Okay, and this is turning to ourselves and looking for values in ourselves. But there's also, I don't know if it's in existentialism, but it's in many philosophies. I think it fits here because we're talking about others. There's this false notion of self, myself, as being isolated from the rest of being. And this actually is not existential, right? Because I'm constructing being. I'm constructing meaning and the structure of the world. I'm projecting, at least I'm responsible for, the nature of that structure. So if I take that personally, I'm not isolated from other beings at all. And petting the cat is part of taking care of myself and the consciousness that I recognize around me, because I care about, my hands and my feet being comfortable, as well as the person next to me being comfortable, because this is all part of consciousness. So it's breaking down these false notions of the world is just me and I'm a billiard ball and Claire is a different billiard ball. No, we're really connected way more than that. And that's breaking down some old notions and recognizing how much a structure of the world allows us to define connection to other individuals. So this a little bit answers taking care of one individual one person at a time, but it still leaves open the question you asked, Shrikant. I'd like to hear what people are thinking about. And someone said this earlier, the community is something else. The idea of a communal suffering, that's a little bit bigger. That kind of consciousness, I'm not sure how to connect to that. I think it's a really good question when we feel a social responsibility to making our community better, not just each individual, but making the possibilities. I don't know. It's a different scope.
Excellent. Thank you, David. Next up is Kevin, followed by Aaron. Kevin.
If everyone else around me happy, I'm going to happy. For sure, no doubt. If somebody, one of people not happy, I need to think about their suffering is my suffering too. That's let's see. I'm also off topic. Let's see in America the house care. It's so basic.
Let's not go to
Okay.
Next up is Aaron.
Yeah, I mean that's okay. I didn't finish mine actually.
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
Obviously from individual, when I help others, my suffering is gone. I'm happy. Let's see another one from the system level, from this corporation, policymaker, government need to systematically think about this. From this structure level, how can it bring everybody on the basic, less suffering, more joy. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Next up is Aaron, followed by Judith.
Yeah, no, I just want to touch upon what Joseph and David said, and that was just a really great point, Kevin. I think that when you embrace that life is suffering, you're able to kind of help people more. And the reason for that is that with your time, you're probably running less towards pleasure, right? So like, I think that if you have a pleasure mindset, you're not going to be all that helpful to people because helping people is yucky, right? We don't want to help people. We want to run to pleasure and run to things that we think are going to make us feel good. But I think when we adapt the mindset that life is suffering, therefore other people are suffering, like Joe said, now we can start helping people because we're not allocating our time to just pleasure. We're actually trying to mitigate our own suffering and then in turn mitigate the suffering of others.
Thank you, Aaron. Next up is Judith. Judith, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Aaron, I agree with that. And that what I was actually going to respond to was, I think it was Pagor who started and talked about, societal suffering, not really, that it's really an individual thing. And when he said it that way, I thought, yeah, that made sense to me because right away, the question itself made me think of things like the Holocaust or, the divisiveness in the country right now, and that's everybody suffering. I mean, everybody that lived in Nazi Germany, whether they were in the concentration camp or not, were like suffering a kind of a sickness, a societal sickness of non-responsiveness but all boils down to really individuals, discrete individuals. So when I think it's true, what Aaron said is when we as individuals take that responsibility to find, ways out of our own suffering and empathize that other people have their unique suffering, then we do become more empathetic. And we then, just offer that instead of being absorbed in our own pain, we realize, wow, you've got your pain, then you're more likely to offer some kind of joy despite whatever your pain is. And if, as a society, as individuals, we all do that, then we can make a better society. We will be less likely to end up in a situation like Nazi Germany in World War II.
Thank you, Judith. Next up is Joe.
Just really briefly, I do think that the idea of where you start to have this experience that you're living in a meaningless life, you have to find meaning in other people. And I think that that's why the reduction of suffering in other individuals is a good approach as for something that you can use for yourself. When we talk about the idea of even appreciating the little things, we're appreciating the little things in the sense that, I think in a way that has a way of actually you're doing little things for other people that allows them to know that everything is okay. That's one way I look at it. And even if you're petting a cat per se, then you're doing something for the cat. It's not in isolation of everything else. That's what I'm pretty much trying to say, is that it's in this. And so there's this other concept in Stoicism that's very interesting, as well as expanding our moral circle as well. As far as how you would see your brother, your neighbor like your brother, and you start to have this, it's hermetic circle. Correct me if I'm wrong, Shrikant. But it's the idea that you're starting to expand this circle, and that you're looking at everybody as somebody that's close to you. And that is true. That works in the sense that if you start treating other people as if they're, somebody that's close to you, then it is a way of getting outside yourself. And in that process, you're ultimately alleviating your own suffering. And so I think that's the critical point, is that, and you can't do it with the idea of going for pleasure, in my opinion, there are philosophies that I know that think that, but the reason why I think that is that that's a form of being on a hedonic treadmill. That if you're constantly seeking this pleasure, that ultimately you're just, you know, constantly going to be looking for, you know, something to satisfy yourself and not others in that process.
Thanks, Joe. Next up is Maritza. Maritza, go ahead.
So much to unpack there. So many great comments. It's weird. I find myself both agreeing with Joe and disagreeing with him at the same time. Kierkegaard tells us that the crowd is untruth. And at the risk of having you guys throw things at me, I'm going to quote one of my absolute favorite statements. And it's from Ayn Rand. I'm a huge fan of several of her philosophical tomes. She says, in order to say I love you, first, you must acknowledge the I. And I find that to be absolutely profound. And I actually see that statement here when we ask the question, as we're looking at a philosophical terminology that embraces the individual, how on earth can we possibly consider the truth, especially when we're looking at philosophers that are telling us that crowd is untruth, the crowd is dangerous, you know, the crowd is a slippery slope towards unthinking, because I think it was Judith who talked about the Holocaust and those things, you know, but that was not a community of suffering. That was a community of sheep not thinking. When you're not thinking, then you have this travesty. But in order to say I love you, first you must acknowledge the I. What you're saying there is that you cannot possibly consider a crowd or community or anyone other than yourself without considering yourself. So if we embrace the existentialist perspective and we focus on the individual as the only primary, the extrapolation here is similar to what Joe was telling us, that as we move, we create our own moral center and we move with purpose. And in so doing, hopefully we will create waves and we will improve the community. You know, there's a Spanish saying that says, dime con quién andas y te cuento quién eres. And when you translate it, it says, tell me with whom you walk and I'll tell you who you are. If one embraces the I and moves forward with purpose, those people with whom one walks will tend to be people that will start doing the same. And they won't do it because you are telling them that's the way they do it. They will do it because they will see something. And something about you will encourage a change within them, which will now make them better as an individual. And now you have two individuals going forth and living by a moral that is maybe slightly above the base that existed before these two people encountered each other. So that's kind of how I recognize and reconcile the potentiality of creating a crowd perspective from the existentialist point of view, which is purely based off of embracing the individual. Thank you.
Excellent, Maritza. So let me build on that. So Ayn Rand wrote this book called Anthem, which is one of her earlier works, which dramatizes this point the best. She talks about a world where people have actually forgotten, or the word I has been just removed from the dictionary. And it is a totalitarian world where everybody is living for the sake of others. So in the, I did a presentation on different kinds of relationships between people. It is like us. Like people have forgotten how to say I. They've actually lost the word, okay? And it's the story of this one person discovering the word I for the first time. Because, and you can see it's him struggling to do that, of saying, you know, it's not quite we, because we is the only word that they have in the language, and he's trying to kind of separate the I out from we. So no, this is we, but we alone, or something like that. And he's trying to kind of figure that out. So, you know, I think Jacob Bronowski put, you know, I got this point from Jacob Bronowski. He says, human being is a very odd animal. You know, we are social solitaries. We are solitary in a very fundamental way, okay? In the decisions that we make, the choices that we make, our will, it's all solitary. At the same time, we live in society and we have immense value to be gotten from interaction with others. But again, in this book, it's very interesting to see that, you know, this character falls in love with this girl. And she also has this kind of burgeoning I in her. And it is the fact that, you know, each of them can actually say I that allows them to do things together. So it's kind of like that. It's like once you kind of understand the I within you and the kind of connection with other, then you see that in analogy, the same thing is going on with other person. And then when you interact with them, you have both those things going on. So you kind of respect the individuality of the other person, that they have a separate base from which they are proceeding. And that is sacred. That's very important in them, just like it is in you. A lot of the American ideas that form America is based on respecting that. You know, it is all about pursuing individuals' pursuit of their own happiness. So that individual, you know, focus on the individual, which actually is radically different. That's what makes America different than any other nation that existed before, because all other nations, in old world, considered society to be primary and individual to be a cog in the wheel and somebody who serves the society. Whereas America, it is exactly opposite in thinking. So this is wonderful, wonderful point. So thank you, Marisa. So Claire, what's any closing thoughts, or more importantly, what's coming up? What's coming up?
Thank you all for joining us tonight. Next week is Big Five. So we will be talking about the Big Five personality traits. This is Peterson's kind of preferred personality test and way of understanding ourselves. This is a really fun, juicy one because we ask you all to bring your personalities to the table, and we'll be comparing and contrasting and really talking about kind of how the different elements of personality and how to make them up. So consider this your Cosmo quiz of Petersonian thought. And then we will do maps of meaning the week after. So really want to get you guys all excited for that. Get the book if you haven't already. We'll also be doing short videos each week. It's really going to be a deep and fantastic series. So can't wait.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, everybody. This was a fantastic meetup. These meetups are getting better and better. I just love them. All right. See you, folks.